If you want BBL allegations, you need to drop the hip thrusters and swap them for back extension. The back extension machine is going to give you so much more volume in the glute. Issue with the hip thruster is if you progressive overload, which a lot of y'all do, you have now made a glute exercise into a quad exercise. Sometimes less is more.
Wow, this is Cat Capone, 682,000 views and 51,000 likes on that. Is the 45-degree hyper better than the hip thrust for glute hypertrophy? We don't know, no studies exist. What I will say is that when I measured muscle activation for many years, I would say hip thrusts are number one and 45-degree hypers are number two. And they're such a slept-on movement. You get the highest glute activation in the squeeze. And I used to believe that EMG mattered really much for muscle growth. What we found in Plotkin 2023 was that EMG activity did not predict glute growth because squats and hip thrusts tied for gluteus maximus hypertrophy, but hip thrusts activate your glutes better. Squats stretch your glutes more. So EMG probably does a good job of estimating the active component to muscle force production, whereas the range of motion and the stretch would do a good job of estimating the passive component to muscle force production. They both matter. So no studies exist. What do I think? I think 45-degree hypers would be better for growing your hamstrings, and they'd grow your glutes well, but it is a very explosive exercise. And when you measure muscle activation, like with a 45-degree hyper, you see tons of big spikes, but maybe has a shortcoming for hypertrophy because you get these very explosive contractions. Could you do a slower tempo? Sure you could. That's just not the way most people do 45-degree hypers, especially in my gym. But as for the progressive overload comment that Kat made, when you go heavier and heavier, you turn it into a quad exercise. I mean, the quads stabilize the knee. You don't move the knee through much knee extension in a barbell hip thrust. You know, the knee moves about this much. The hip moves through a much greater range. You do feel your quads a lot more. Like I feel my quads a ton with hip thrusts, but in the Plotkin study, the quads grew roughly half of what they grew in the squat. Also, I did an experiment once where I measured muscle activation with heavier and heavier hip thrusts. Here are the results. You see muscle activation does continue to go up, even as you approach a 1 rep max. So glute activation doesn't drop off. What I think is you just feel the quads and the hamstrings and sometimes the adductors and the erectors working harder because it's really heavy, it's really hard. But you could say that about every exercise. As you use progressive overload with the 45-degree hyper, you're gonna feel it more in the low back. You're gonna feel it more in the hamstrings. And you could say that about deadlift, squats. So I don't like that rationale, but I do love that she pointed out how awesome 45-degree hypers are. We do them with body weight, with dumbbells, with barbells, with bands. We do neutral, we do rounded flared, we do single leg prisoner, one leg at a time with your hands behind your head. They're all amazing, and I think more of you should do 45-degree hypers for glutes because they never took off on social media the way Bulgarians and Romanians and step-ups and hip thrusts have. I'm Bret Contreras, aka The Glute Guy.